with Professor Yasushi Sato from Niigata University in Japan. I also believed that you, Sato, work with the JST, the Japanese Science and Technology Agency. I had the pleasure of meeting you and already getting a snapshot of the analysis you're showing while I was visiting Japan earlier this year, so I've been looking forward to that a lot. Second speaker this afternoon is Nadira Karunavira, who's the chair and professor of parasitology, if I said that right, Nadira, at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Colombo, and also president of the National Academy of Sciences of Sri Lanka. Is that correct? Yes, it is correct. Good. Thirdly, we have Agnieszka Gradzina. She's deputy head of unit at the Joint Research Center, which is the science service of the European Commission. Great collaborator. It's good to have you here, Aga. We've been looking forward to your presentation as well. Then finally, but not least, we have Selim Louafi, who's the deputy director for research and strategy at SCHIRAT. That's the French Agricultural Research Center for International Development. And then we have Precious Lukili, who's a policy officer at the South African National Advisory Council on Innovation within the Department of Science and Technology in Pretoria, who will give us some reflections and help me to do summing up and wrapping up the session. So as you can hear, we have quite a number of speakers, quite a number of different perspectives from around the globe, and we will try as far as possible to keep the talks short and brief, and then we will move on into discussion. So without further ado, I welcome all of you to the session and gives the word to you, Sato. Welcome.
Thank you very much. My name is Yasushi Sato from Niigata University, Japan. Today I will talk about a case study on Japan's ecosystem for science policy interface. This session is about mapping and evaluating ecosystems of the science policy interface. My presentation gives cross-sectoral perspectives on this issue based on a comparative study of EBPM, EIPM, of 12 policy fields in Japan. The types of evidence and the manners in which evidence is used vary greatly by policy fields. So we have compared the current status and challenges of SPI in various fields. And we have identified common challenges as well as field-specific challenges for SPI and diverse approaches to them. Well, one of the key themes of this INGSA conference is expanded evidence. So we have just had a plenary panel. Well, actually, in recent discussions on EBPM, EIPM, the term evidence tends to be used more flexibly and construed more broadly than in the past. Not just randomized controlled trials and other rigorous methods, evidence could encompass data, facts, future projections, and so on. The role of evidence is not only to provide a basis for policy, but to have a gradual long-term effect, inspiring discussion and new policy thinking. So we have adopted a fairly broad definition of evidence, but not really expanded evidence. Here I show an illustration of the science policy interface. SPI can be variously conceived, but Gluckman et al., for example, notes that SPI is a dynamic ecosystem of organizational structures and processes performing 4 functions, that is, the generation, synthesis, brokerage, and communication of scientific knowledge. So we have adopted this conception of SPI. And if you look at the Japanese ecosystem of SPI, there are diverse actors, organizations, processes, as in other countries. But if I point out a few characteristics of the Japanese ecosystem of SPI, government committees are dominant, and the National Academy is relatively weak. Also, chief science advisors for ministers and prime ministers were recently installed, but still developing. Okay. So this is the overview of Japan's ecosystem for SPI. But if you look at specific fields, the picture is somewhat different. We have looked at 12 policy fields. And for example, fields like climate change and monetary policies are characterized by strong organizations and human resources. So they have very established ecosystem for SPI. Chemicals control, public works, nuclear safety. Those fields are characterized by emphasis on process rules. So basic methodologies for utilizing evidence are in place, but of course, human intervention must be necessary. Finally, pandemic response, school education, and science, technology, and innovation. Those fields are characterized by brokerage through close collaboration between experts and the government. Those fields have strong communities of practitioners. So if you look at those cross-sectoral studies, the basic structure of SPI varies by policy fields. And by comparing 12 fields, we have identified some general challenges for the science policy interface. First, you have challenges, a set of challenges for collecting and accumulating data. And then you have challenges regarding data analysis using various models. Because if there are many models, you have to choose between them, or you have to combine them in order to get the best results. And that entails some challenges. Then there are challenges of integrating evidence with expertise and practical knowledge. That might be actually the issue of expanded evidence. Okay, then you have to secure modes of evidence brokerage. Some modes are formal and others are informal. And then when you have those modes of brokerage, you have to coordinate the process of evidence brokerage properly. Finally, you have to communicate with society with regard to evidence, because without the understanding of society, you cannot implement policies. We have also identified some detailed issues with regards to those challenges, but I cannot go into details now. Okay, let me wrap up. It does. Okay. For an SPI ecosystem to perform its functions, connectivity and coordination between diverse actors and processes are critical. Yeah. But the basic structure and operating mode of SPI ecosystem could be quite different from one policy field to another. While common challenges for the SPI ecosystem can be identified, approaches for addressing those challenges are diverse depending on policy fields. So policy fields take different approaches in tackling those challenges that I showed before. although good practice in one field does not necessarily apply to another, mutual learning would be possible. So my presentation offered an explanation of a case study, a comparative study of Japanese EBPM. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Sato-san. That was very helpful to get us started and to stay in the ecosystem framework. I think you made it very clear to us that an ecosystem also have different niches and that you have different epistemic cultures within the ecosystem, and it was a really vivid way of visualizing that to us, that the different ministerial departments have their own ways of organizing their scientific advisory mechanisms, but that there also at the same time needs to be some coordination. I will now pass the word on to Nadira. Please join us up here, Nadira, or wherever you want to stand or sit.
Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Professor Remy and also Professor Viho from the INGSA Asian chapter for inviting me and also making it possible for me to get here. To move on, I'm going to give you a snapshot of this study that we did on science advice systems in the Australasian region. Before I get to the study, I would like to indicate, in case you are not familiar with that region, Sri Lanka is an island in the Indian Ocean, and at this end you see the Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo, to which I am affiliated, and also the National Academy of Sciences of Sri Lanka. In fact, I am the immediate past president. We just had the AGM a few weeks back. Right. So the trigger to this study was the COVID-19 pandemic. It really highlighted the need for an effective framework for science advice in Sri Lanka. So that really made us aware that we need to look into this. So this was a collaborative study with 10 partner academies in the Australasian region. The list of countries are given there, and also this map will show you the spread where the country representation. So we had a fairly wide spread in the Australasian region. So in total, there were 11 countries represented, and I'm happy to see one or two members here present in the audience as well. So the aims of this study was to facilitate the development or strengthening of systematic science advice in partner countries, improve awareness among partners on a range of laws and regulations that exist legitimizing these institutions and the processes used for government science advice, and lastly, to develop capacities of participating science academies in providing science advice to enable them to play a role and be part of this entire process. So the methodology that we used was we had a series of webinars with partner academy representatives to discuss and agree on the methods to be used. We used mainly a structured questionnaire to gather data to do something called a situation analysis of the different science advice systems that operate in these partner countries. And we also use case studies on past scenarios that triggered new policies to be introduced or policy changes to be implemented in each country, these case studies were really meant to reinforce the findings of the situation analysis that we did through the questionnaire data. We did a SWOT analysis of the existing systems in each country through the data that we gathered through these questionnaires. And these were presented and discussed at a physical meeting that we had in Colombo with all partner representatives being there. So the data analysis, the responses to the questionnaire were analyzed through a framework that we refer to as the Colombo framework. And there were 5 main components: selection of advisors, structure of organizations with the relevant mandate, process of collating and synthesizing the advice, communication of advice, the method that they use for that, and evaluation of the process and the impact. So each of these areas were looked at through the questionnaire to gather the data from each of these countries. And the results really indicated that, as expected, a range of structures and processes that operate in regional countries. And it also highlighted the effectiveness of having strong, independent, and well-resourced institutions with adequate capacity for knowledge gathering and sharing that the government can trust and rely on to obtain advice to aid policy making. So these were the highlights or the summary points that we could get out of this study. So in conclusion, the processes used in science advice and their apparent effectiveness vary widely in these different countries, and many regional countries, including Sri Lanka, seem to lack strong structures or frameworks, legitimized processes for their governments to effectively use science advice to aid policy making. So there's a big void there. The key outcomes of the study were this report was published and it is available on the web. And we also released what is referred to as the Colombo Declaration, which really called on governments to institutionalize science advice. And this declaration was disseminated widely, and all the partner academies were signatories to this declaration. So we now have a validated questionnaire and also a framework to analyze the data and methods that could be used to replicate these studies in different parts of the world. In Sri Lanka, of course, it enhanced awareness among scientific community and the public regarding the importance of science advice systems and evidence-based policy making. So there are efforts that are being continued to develop contextualized roadmaps for science advice through an iterative process, making use of the lessons learned, particularly the good practices that stood out in this study. So before I end, I would like to acknowledge other team members of this project. The names are given here, Saroj, Priyan, and Ranjit, and also financial assistance that was given by the Inter-Academy Partnership. The finances were channeled through INGSA, which is the Asian Academy Network, and the study partners from regional academies and societies who were part of this process of doing this study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadira, and also thank you for reminding us that actually mapping ecosystems and surveying collaboration and connectivity, it makes use of some methodologies. And you already mentioned how you took advantage of the workshop format, which is more in depth and more sort of qualitative, but at the same time also developed a survey with which you can get a sort of a more broad spectrum analysis of how your ecosystem is working. And finally, I also take away from your talk that it needs a bit of resources. This is not something that you just do out of the blue. in order to map and evaluate your ecosystem and really get the actors to speak to each other, you do need to sort of convey and convene the different actors and stakeholders and have them talk together and also provide data. So thank you for mentioning all those things. I think that fits very nicely to the next presentation by you, Agnieszka, who will present our project for the European Commission and what the European Union have been doing to promote a healthy ecosystem for scientific advice across Europe.
Thanks so much, David. I have a lot of slides, but don't worry, I will not bore you with all of them. EU as such has a very long tradition of using science to policy. We have a member states where you have it in the constitutional order for like 50 or 60 years already that the scientist needs to be consulted while designing the legislation. And nevertheless, even in Europe, science and policy is not much made in heaven. It's not marriage of love. It's a marriage of convenience, very often the marriage that actually needs counseling. And similarly to what Nadira was saying, we were actually a bit prone by COVID and how it went in the different directions in the different member states and somehow how it was contradictory and confusing. And we start looking a bit more in depth what actually happened there. So there is a momentum now, I will not go into details through that, there is a political momentum in the European Union for science, for policy. Member states, governments of the member states see the need to enhance their science for policy ecosystem. But if we're talking about ecosystem and why we are talking about the ecosystem, we are very close to the notion of the ecosystem. I know you can call it differently. You can call it interface, you can call it architecture. We prefer to go with the ecosystem notion. Why? Usually when you talk about the interface, you look at this, actors. And this is only a small part of the actors only on one side, basically. This is like the supply side, so the ones that are producing science or are knowledge brokerage. But it's so much more. Science for policy is so much more, and this is what it also is. It goes cross domains. It goes in different policies. It goes in different scientific domains. We're talking here also about the processes, about different tools, scientific methods like foresight. We're talking about the different policy process like the impact assessments. We are finally talking here, for example, about the HR policies. How do you exchange pairing schemes, shadowing, and so on and so forth. And the final issue is also you need to talk about the governance. So what really are the limits of science? What science can deliver, what science cannot deliver? But also how you identify normative foundations for evidence-informed policy making. So we start studying. So we discussed it with the 16 member states out of 28 that we have now at the workshops. And we also ran a Science for Policy Ecosystem Survey. We did the literature review, and what we found out is that we don't know much more than we knew, and that we actually need a systematic analytical framework to understand what the data that we gather mean, frankly speaking, but also to help the member states to identify their needs or the problems that they have. And the results of this, if I manage to change the slide, voila. We have developed in the European Commission, we have developed 3 evaluation projects. One is the one that we're actually doing with David, and this is the evaluation framework for science for policy ecosystem. And the result of the collaboration with David were 3 reflection papers and an evaluation framework. When we talk about the evaluation framework, it's not the evaluation framework in your understanding. There is no good or bad. And that's very problematic for assessing. This is more the assessment for assessing the science for policy ecosystems. And we actually discovered that there is a huge challenge in quantifying. It's very challenging to find good indicators. So instead, we went actually more with developing the questions for assessment on the basis of which you assess more or less what your ecosystem is. Another thing, you need to do it fit for purpose. if the member states differ, and we're still talking about Europe, imagine how world is different. What kind of different institutional setups you have, what kind of different political or scientific culture you have. So it's always fit for purpose. And finally, we try not only quantify, but also qualify, to do the quality assessment of those echoes. Because the thing that you have a system in place, it doesn't mean that the system actually really works. You need to assess, is it really working? So this is why we go with this notion of productive interactions. Is really the scientific advice having an impact? So this is one thing, and this focus on two sides of this equation. So we're talking here about science, and we're talking here also about the policymaker side. We have another one that is focusing solemnly on public administration. This is also developed by the European Commission, where our colleagues from the branch dealing with the public administration reform developed the indicators. This is still forthcoming. To assess how the institutionalization looks in the member states. Are there any organizational structures there? Are there any processes that are established, and so on and so forth? And we in the GRC put the two together and actually start doing practical work with the member states. And we have a project that we're implementing now, going to analyze in depth what's going on in the specific member states. And this is the analytical framework for that. And I'm not going into details, but you can see that it goes in 4 levels, from individual to system level, because you need to look at the system. And then it goes on supply, on demand, and in between. I'm almost there, David, no worries.
You're good on time.
But from all those work that we did and the assessment that we were actually conducting, we've learned 3 things. 3 major challenges, as we're seeing them in Europe, but I'm sure you can find very well and you can identify those challenges also in your countries. First one is the institutional fragmentation, or lack of lack of institutions. Missing connections, missing coordination. My favorite example, if we're talking here about the decarbonization, and you have a Ministry of Climate having a scientific advisor and the Ministry of Energy having the scientific advisor, and those scientific advisors do not talk to each other. Moreover, they're actually giving a contradictory advice. Here's the situation we are talking about. Another big thing is individual capacities. Scientists are not taught and are not rewarded for working with policymakers, and the same is on the policymaking side. Policymakers' job, and they pay, depends on something else than working with the scientists, and we are missing the skills to communicate and to actually work together. And the third one is what I was also mentioning before, good governance of science. Where are the limits of science? So for all 3, of course, we identify the challenges. It's not that we are now happy, okay, these are the challenges, here you go, do something with them. No, we try to help. So when we're talking about strengthening the institutional processes, we are talking here mainly about boundary organization and the knowledge brokerage organization. In Europe, but also worldwide, you see that usually you have already academia in place at some level. There is great science available already worldwide. And you have public administration in place that is, in theory, having some capacities already to work with science. What we are missing is the translators, is those guys, those single bees between the 2 swarms that are actually connecting those 2 words. So this is what we work very much with when we try to enhance the capacity in Europe. Another one, limits of science. We are not talking here about expectocracy. Science cannot replace political decision, and it will never do, because we understand now how we take the political decision. And facts and evidence is only one factor. We all think, I'm sure, we all think, we scientists especially love to think that we are very rational people. We are not. We are all biased. And the my side bias, the strongest of them all, that does not depend on your intelligence, will make you attack facts if they're going against your beliefs and your values, your core values that you have. You will all attack them. I would attack them, probably. So these are the reports that we came up with, trying to understand how we make the political decision, and knowing that, how to work with that. If we know that values influence how you take the decision and how you see the facts, so what to do with that in the policy-making process. we are also working closely with the citizens, and we are also looking at the modern technologies and what they do and how they manipulate people to think what they are prone to think. And my final slides, talking about the individual competences. We're also not leaving the scientists and the policymakers alone. We developed 2 competence frameworks. The upper one is for the policymakers. The lower one is for scientists. And that, on the basis of this competence framework, they basically give you what kind of competences, skills, attitudes you need to have to work well in this ecosystem. On the basis of this, we developed trainings that we are actually train our own scientists in the GRC, we are training our own policymakers in the European Commission, and we're training both sides in the member states. And that's it. Thank you, dear colleagues. I'm happy to then reply to your questions afterwards.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Excellent. And also thank you for our collaboration. It's been actually quite rewarding to work together with an institution that actually takes your report and your framework and turns it into sort of reality. Just made a colleague over coffee. This is what INGSA conferences can do, who is piloting the framework in Finland. We are piloting it also now in Denmark, and we are piloting it within the European Commission. So it's great to see that these things actually move forward. I also wanted to mention, which we don't necessarily have to dwell a lot upon today, but we did try to get away from the sort of market-based metaphor of push and pull or supply and demand. When I wrote the report for the Commission, I had no less than 6 different peer reviewers, so-called critical friends. And of course, this sneaks in everywhere, that you have a supply side of scientists who are overly eager to communicate their researchers, and you have a demand side of policymakers who are a little bit reluctant, who are constantly focusing on feasibility and the policy cycle and the pragmatic side of things. And then it's just a matter of how much research can you push into policy. And when we start looking upon these processes from an empirical point of view, it's much more entangled. There is much more dynamism and interactions and people being able to advise or give informal advice to different institutions, or even produce reports. So there is what we call a knowledge flow, or flow of ideas across the ecosystem, which might not be caught by your ordinary assessment metrics. Certainly you can not only do a citation analysis and look at citations to your academic literature and policy reports, and you can also just not look at how people are citing research in Parliament. You need to look at the, as you said, Agnieszka, you need to look at the productive interactions. So if you're interested in any of those methodologies, they're in the report, and it's publicly available. So perhaps we can come back to a couple of those points, but before that we will now go to the real global level, Salim. We will end by zooming out and looking a bit at the global ecosystem of scientific advice, among other things. So over to you.
Yes, thank you, David. And unlike my colleagues, I stick to the no slides rule that seemed to apply yesterday and not today. But then I still have few illustrations which are not really slides, but just to make it more lively. But I will focus my short talk on some work that I conducted with a range of collaborators, and mainly at the initiative of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. So, and I will cover mainly 4 points rapidly. One is a guidance document on strengthening science policy interface at national level for agri-food system transformation that has been now released and open for consultation, public consultation. And then I will say a few words about an analytical descriptive framework to compare global SPI, to look at the ecosystem of SPI, but more like from an analytical point of view. And then a few words about the challenge of impact assessment of SPI along the line that you just described, and some concluding words about the Montpellier process, a process that I've been involved into and that took place recently in Montpellier then. So just to start, no, that's not the one. So, yeah. Okay, it's this one. Yes, the work with FAO started from the observation that the current science policy interface landscape for agri-food system, like many other complex issue, global complex issue, is populated by a plurality of initiatives and actors that act at different scales, producing knowledge for decision making at various levels of granularity, and for different purposes. So, and at the end of the day, countries have to make sense of all that complex landscape to tackle, to respond to their complex problem in their countries. So for this reason, and in line with the action plan of the FAO Science and Innovation Strategy of the Chief Scientist Office, developed by the Chief Scientist Office, FAO has developed a draft guidance on strengthening science policy interface at the national level, to which I heavily contributed. So this draft guidance is of institutional nature. It includes really generic elements that are not specific to the domain of agri-food system and that could apply to a lot of other similar wicked problem, let's say. And it includes core elements for functional SPI to be considered, as well as more hands-on and operational aspect related to how SPI could operate. So this guidance document is really intended to be a tool to facilitate reflection. It's definitely not a blueprint. It's really about looking at how to advance an SPI ecosystem, how to what could be its possible scope and mandate, and also with the idea to launch a learning process around SPI. So it's really, it does not, again, offer a blueprint, but as Sir Farah has said this morning, it's really there to offer options to support the establishment of a functional SPI ecosystem that would really depend on national priorities, national capacities, national existing resources. So there is no gold standard provided here, and it's again envisioned to be a living document and improve over time through further iteration and guidance. And that's why it's open for public consultation on this website that I've indicated here until the 8th of May. So feel free to contribute to this e-consultation and get your inputs and suggestions and comments to further improve this guidance. And with the idea also that we will test it in few countries that are interested to make use of that document. And in relation to the topic of this panel session, the guidance document recommends that before engaging in reforming or establishing an SPI, it's important to take stock of existing organization actors involved in the science policy interface activities and what are the structure and processes already in place. And this mapping of potential elements of science policy interface ecosystem could be done from a descriptive standpoint without any assessment of them, but more to describe the diversity. And that can be done through a diversity of entry point or perspective. And that leads to my second point, because as part of the preparation of this guidance document, I've been involved in a scoping study on global SPI together with, actually under the coordination of my colleague from Arizona State University, Eric Welsh, Professor Eric Welsh, a scoping study on global SPI to understand the characteristics and the function of SPI activities and organizations that operate at this global level. And through this work, the objective was really to provide a broad overview and comparison, allow comparison of how global SPI work based on a set of very limited and simple categories to allow comparing things that are quite different, either in terms of domain or ways of operating. And we've done that in the sector of agriculture, health, environment, and that's it, I think, yes. So we've developed a kind of analytical framework for comparing horizontally different SPI, and again, to provide a lens to which to look for complementarity and also allow to connect this ecosystem. And yes, our framework, again, it's quite simplistic, but it's based on a comprehensive literature that identifies 3 key components of SPI, which formulates the idea to formulate an easily communicated vocabulary of constructs and measures used to characterize and compare those global SPI. So we have 3 components, mainly. One around governance, which are the formal and informal structure, norms, rules, and procedures for coordination and collaboration among different actors. So that's the governance part. Then you have the co-production that describes the mechanism by which different stakeholders and knowledge types are integrated and recognized in those activities around in these SPIs. And then a third one that represent the intention, the learning, dimension that represent the intention and capacity of the SPI to learn, to gain insight from what works and what doesn't work, and as it carries out its task. And for each of those big categories, we've developed different set of subcategories with indicators and metrics to again be able to compare different global SPIs. And the important point here is that those pillars obviously operate in concert and influence each other. You need a governance system to enable co-production and learning, but similarly, learning is both a potential outcome of co-production and a means of addressing what might be misaligned or counterproductive from a governance point of view. So by examining all those 3 components, the report really tried to explain the extent to which an SPI recognizes and integrate the complexity of a non-linear approach to and process between science and policy. So now let's move to my, I hope I'm still good in terms of time.
Yes.
My third point is about impact assessment. And of course, a mapping is, if it is to be useful, would also benefit not only from a pure descriptive analysis, but also an evaluative perspective in terms of what works and what doesn't work in this current ecosystem. And obviously, the understanding of the impact of science-policy interface is quite a dynamic and evolving field, but policy is so messy that for now, no consensus exists on a set of standardized indicator for evaluating impact across SPI to enable precisely some comparison and draw lesson on what a successful SPI would look like. So in this context, actually, the more conventional evaluation method based on identified effect or specific intervention on predefined outcome are not very well adapted because of this complexity. But the most, as you said, the most common approach is informed usually by a simple and linear conceptualization in which knowledge inform and shape policy and measure by very narrow indicators such as citation in policy document. And obviously this does not do justice to this, what you talked about, those productive interaction and the fact that you have different actors participating in SPIs, and we can think about things going on at the individual level of researcher or decision maker, like you can measure increased trust, you can measure how empowered scientists are. At the group level or network level, you can look at the density of social interaction, the knowledge exchange, the improved knowledge exchange, and at the institutional level, you could also think about enhanced capacity of policy institution to interact with and make use of research, the enhanced also entrenchment of SPI within national institution, or the enhanced identification of policy windows for SPI, for specific SPI intervention. So all those are part of this, could be part of this impact assessment, and there are various methods to do that, and I would be really happy also to look at the paper that you were mentioning, or book. It's a book.
It's
right?
a framework report.
So my last point now, the fourth and last one, is referring to an ecosystem enabled precisely to look at, as Agnieszka has just mentioned, to consider the connections beyond only the structures and the organization. And that was the focus of the Montpellier process. So the Montpellier process, yeah, so that took place a few months ago in Montpellier. And this process brought together different, I think we were like almost 300 experts and decision makers, including scientists, policymakers, civil society representatives from 60 countries and 5 continents. And for 2 days, and based on lessons learned from concrete use case at the local level, city level, at the landscape level, at the national level, at the regional level, at the global level. So we've covered the whole interscale, cross-scale aspect. So participants worked together. It was really an interactive workshop based on those use cases to identify the imperative for what we call the knowledge communities to accelerate and amplify their contribution to those wicked problems such as food system transformation. The meeting has mainly focused on this topic as a first start, with the idea of moving away from the insufficiency of the sectoral and disciplinary approach and of the linear transfer of knowledge approach also. So the challenge is really and that's not new obviously, was to try to manage to take better advantage of the various components of the SPI ecosystem and build a kind of what we've called the intelligence connecting tissue that really is able to connect sectors, different knowledge systems, and local and global contexts. So that was the focus of this convening, that will hopefully lead to a process that will continue and lead to new concrete activities that will take up this challenge of establishing this functional connecting tissue. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Selim. Yes, welcome back to the podium for the speakers. Thank you also for introducing the guidebook. I think there is a lot of productive overlaps with the framework of the European Commission, so we can explore that more in detail. I also take from your presentation another key element which is important, I hope also for the audience interaction that we will begin with in a second, namely the fact that even though we are speaking about evaluation, it would be very hard and also to some extent impossible to do like a ranking of who is sort of doing the best science to policy interface. It needs to be based on a contextual understanding of the knowledge community and the epistemic culture within each of the communities or institutions or policy areas in which you're trying to understand the health of the ecosystem. So just to compare different institutions across is going to probably produce counterproductive outcomes. And this was also feedback we have gotten trying to do impact assessment, that you very easily have, especially the policymakers, making the entire conversation a question about the beauty contest in which everybody wants to look as though they are using and capitalizing on science all the time, which they might not be doing. So avoid the beauty contest and go more for the so-called formative evaluation frameworks in which really learning is at the center. I also take from your framework, Selim. So we almost covered the entire globe. We've been around a couple of different corners, and we will end in South Africa and hand the word to you, Precious, to sort of give us a couple of reflections upon what you got from the panel this morning.
Thank you so much, David, and is it morning or good afternoon to everyone in the room, and thank you to the panelists. So what I'll do, I'll go through some of the themes that we're picking up around the challenges that each of these systems are facing, because we are kind of seeing a lot of similar challenges, and then maybe I'll give just a recap around South Africa, what's happening there. Then we'll pose some questions that we're hoping will spark a discussion around some of these challenges that we see. All right. So we've heard a lot around the need for strong organizations that can kind of anchor, this, and also an emphasis on the processes and the rules that kind of govern the system. We heard from Japan that your basic structure actually encompasses this, and communication being very important. Some of the challenges that we heard around the coordination of evidence, communication again. We went to Sri Lanka, where we heard about the Colombo framework. And amongst other things, it has the evaluation, or it tries to evaluate the process and impact, which is something that I think a lot of colleagues in the room would be interested in. And some lacks or some challenges that they're facing, again, similar to Japan, is the need for strong institutions and the lack of processes. So that is another theme that we see to be coming up again. So it sounds great that there was the Colombo Declaration that called for institutions, or kind of the institutionalization of science advice. Again, we're hearing that collaboration and coordination is another big requirement. The GRC I liked a lot. What I heard when INGSA said, these systems is not, just about the actors and the flow of information. It's also beyond this, the incorporation of foresight, not just to understand the system now, but where the system will move into in the future. It's about HR processes and other support processes, governance issues. We always say that it always drills down to the values of the system. So those are also very important to understand what they are. Again, the need for frameworks to deepen understanding is another lack that we're picking up. We heard that it's difficult. It seems difficult to find some good indicators, both from a quantitative and a qualitative perspective. Challenges, again, institutional fragmentation and coordination, individual capacities, and good governance is coming up again. Maybe let's then go to the questions that we hoping would spark some conversations around this. We hear that collaboration is a big requirement, and it's a big lack at the same time. So maybe it's a question to the panelists, but also for people in the room to also think around this. Who is coordinating this system? Sometimes it's not very obvious who is setting the directionality. But when you study, when you do that mapping, you start to see that, there is an organization that maybe is making some progress. So it's something to think about. And is there an institution that is setting the agenda or directionality? Usually these are the organizations that would publish foresight reports. Do we have something like this? Do you have something like that in your system? And also we speak a lot about silos that are existing in the system. And we've been speaking a lot about silos, for some time now. So we're thinking that we also need to understand these silos. Why are they there in the first place? Why were they created, and what is reinforcing them? When we understand these silos, then we can, be able to penetrate them. It's almost like being able to understand what makes these regimes, and come up with different niches to try and here's another one that actually excites me because it's relevant to South Africa. So we have been speaking a lot around national systems of innovation, and people or a lot of countries understand more around that. But now we are speaking about science for policy ecosystems. We recognize that they're not the same, but there may be overlaps. What are these overlaps and the things like that? And also, how is the flow of ideas and knowledge organized and supported within the system? I know that JRC, if I can say, enjoys a lot of political, so you'd have a political leader. So it's almost like you have demand for, let's say, the foresight work that you would be doing. But in systems where you'd find that the demand is not there, then you find that, you'd have good research, you'd have good advice, but no one takes this, And maybe just to share a bit around South Africa, we don't have, in our system, we've mapped our system, but we speak more around the National System of Innovation. We have a council called the National Advisory Council on Innovation, and part of its mandate is to advise the minister and to have conversation with the president around science, technology, and innovation. So by mandate, in a way, the National Advisory Council is an advisor for science as well, but we don't really call it the scientific, but we do recognize ourselves as that boundary organization. So this is also to say, it's different countries understand their systems better. So as much as we are sharing with, the panel has been sharing their experiences, it's very important for each one of us to be able to contextualize. So these questions are not only for the panel, but also if you would like to share from your experiences, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much, Precious, for getting us kicked off. This is actually the cue for everyone in the room to wake up now just before lunch and articulate your own reflections. I will start just giving the panel a brief chance to reflect a little bit upon the questions on, I believe, agency and governance was some of the things Precious fleshed out. Who is it actually who's responsible for doing the mapping or the evaluation? Who's giving the mandate? Precious is asking. I think that's a valid point. An ecosystem often is something that we believe is self-organizing, but is this really the case? So who is it that is watching the watchers? Who is it that's doing science on the science advice system? Pick up the microphone and let it go, Precious, down the road if somebody wants to.
Okay. Ecosystem is somewhat autonomous, but in my view, ecosystem of science policy interface is special because it needs money in order to operate. There are many actors and organizations in the ecosystem, but many of them need money in order to play its roles. For example, the Japanese Academy of Sciences, they recently had some conflict with the Japanese government, whether it should be a government organization, part of the government, or it should be privatized. And that is related to the issue of how to secure the funding for the operation of the academy. And depending on the source of the money, perhaps the degree of independence of the academy differs. And also the relationship with other organizations are affected by the structure of the funding. So that's just my idea.
Okay, thank you, Sato. Pass the word to Selim. Okay, Nadira, you can take the word if you like.
No,
Go for it.
I just wanted to add that in our experience, crisis situations really make the policymakers to reach out to
Yeah.
professionals.
Yes.
However, lack of a system can
Yes.
mess up the process.
Totally.
Yeah. Sri Lanka is, I think, a case in point that bad policies has led to drastic
Yes.
repercussions. So that's what I wanted to point out.
I actually fully agree with Nadira. It's or crisis or high regulation. Where you look when the scientific advice works the most is usually in the implementation of highly regulated pieces, like food safety, for example. Politicians have no choice but to go to scientists. But Precious, you ask many questions, many of them very difficult to reply, frankly speaking, on who's coordinating science for policy. I don't think it's fair to say there's one solution to that. It's very context dependent. We in the GRC strongly believe, and this is what I also presented, is that you really need to work with the boundary organization and with the knowledge brokers. They are the ones that are there on the edge of both worlds, and they are the ones that that have the connection in both worlds. And this is how it looks a bit in the Commission, where the GRC, as a knowledge broker, is basically driving this, and we see it in the member states when we work now closely with several member states. These are, again, the knowledge brokers, or actually more often actors on the scientific side. I'm talking here about the research councils and so on and so forth. For silos, that's a good question. Silos is probably because we are still focusing a bit, and this is what was said in the session before, I think, by Sir Peter Gluckman. Financing of science, if we're talking about silos in science, is not basically adjusted to the times that we are living, and it does not incentivize cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary work. And the same is happening in the policy-making world. It's the effectiveness. This is the key. Do I deliver? Is my policy there if the people are more or less able to vote for me next elections? Again, there is a lack of incentives on both sides to go outside the silos. Voilà.
Yeah. Okay, Salim, the microphone traveled quite a long way to you, but
No,
now
but
it's
that's
there.
perfect.
Yes, it is.
And actually, it will be complementary. Just two quick remarks, actually. So first, I will probably state the obvious, but there is a discipline on science of science. It's and those people so it's an area of knowledge to describe, and there are methods to do this kind of, in the academic world, this kind of work. So I think those experts need to be recognized as such. And usually, I've participated to several SPI at the international or global level, at the international or national level, and usually those people are not asked to even help to design those SPI or to contribute to the functioning of those SPI. Because when those SPI that are existing are thinking of expert to call upon to help them, they think about expert by domain, by their specific area that they want to tackle, and they don't think about expert about the design, about the design and the functioning of SPI. And that was the beauty of this guidance document, because for the first time we managed to bring those experts on the design of SPI in helping to come up with something that was really built on the existing literature that is very wide on this question of SPI. So, and the second point, very quickly, is just the learning dimension also, which involve this kind of reflexive aspect about where I stand as an SPI within a broader ecosystem. And to do that, you have, and that's where those experts could help also, again, is to invest in better understanding your contribution in a broader context. So that that's an element of the learning and the reflexivity that is also needed for each and every SPI. And usually does not exist, actually.
I take it that you probably in these responses take for granted that there is a mandate, but I think the spirit of the question was also that you need to have a strong mandate in order to to become a science policy advisor or even do a mapping of your ecosystem, that it needs to come from within government. I think that was what I was fishing for, that if there is no interest within government to have a well-functioning ecosystem, then it's very difficult for us as independent experts to organize it. I think that was in the subtext, but thank you for creating that nuance. We have a reflection from the audience, and I will also poke a couple of other people here. We'll start at the front, please.
Hello, my name is Anna Maria Arabia. I'm the Chief Executive at the Australian Academy of Science. Thank you for your presentations. They were excellent. And thank you, Nadira. We were involved in your mapping and it was a tremendous privilege and opportunity. So thank you. My question may seem tangential, but it goes to the ecosystem we're talking about and something that hasn't been spoken about at INGSA that I'm aware of. What do you see as the role of consultants in the ecosystem? And much like you, I roll my eyes a little bit, but this is actually really important because I'm talking about the McKinseys, the Deloittes, those organisations which at least in Australia, and I'm not sure if this is the case in your respective regions and countries, are often the recipients of requests for policy information from government. And if I'm honest, I'm sadly reflecting more often than the Australian Academy of Science would receive that. And it's not always evidence informed, but I think we would be foolish to not recognise their role in the ecosystem. Is there a role for collaboration? Mm-hmm. Do we try and compete? I'm really keen to get your reflections on their role in this ecosystem we're speaking about if we are to be impactful and to get as much evidence into policy making as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect. So the role of consultants, perhaps think tanks and stuff like that. Any reflections?
Yes, I can take this one, unless we go with other questions first.
Say again.
I can take this one on the consultants, unless you want to.
No, I don't. I will take it now. Yeah, go ahead, Anitska.
Okay, on the consultants, Europe is very prone to use consultancy. There are member states in the EU that basically solemnly depend in consultancy advice. Also, European Commission using sometimes consultants to provide the study. There are two key aspects for that. First of all, it's building the capacity within the specific public administration and the governments to actually be able to understand what they are provided with, to understand the scientific evidence and to understand also what the consultants are providing. Also how to judge on the quality of provided basically advice. And this is one of the main issues that we are dealing when we are advising now the member states. It's building the in-house capacity to understand. Of course, sometimes the consultant advice is very useful and sometimes is everything you need. Sometimes the issues are far deeper and sometimes they need a much broader analysis. It's usually easier to the governments or public administration to reach the consultants because they get a product that is readable for them and basically ready to use. It's with the scientific community, it involves more discussion, it involves more design together. And I think we missed somewhere the point how we are, how in public administration we are approaching those issues. And this is why we're very much trying to change that trend, also for people in public administration to understand the weight and to weight the evidence, basically. And to be and to also build their capacities to work with the scientists to ask the right questions from the very beginning. Then the process is much easier. If you bring the scientists at the level of where you actually need to deliver an impact assessment in 2 weeks, that's far too late. Because what you should do is to design the question, what is really the problem that you're trying to solve? If you look, for example, this is my colleague from Greece that always giving this example. The traffic jams in Greece, this is a problem. And Greek government for years was basically building yet another lane. That was supposed to solve the problem. They never went to the deep analysis, what is the root cause of this problem? And this is for what we don't have time very often in the policy. We need to be fair for the public administration. They work under huge time constraints that science do not understand.
Yeah. Okay.
And for them, it's very difficult when scientists are also not prepared to meet somewhere midway with them. But again, building the capacities of scientists to deliver the advice that is actually needed, that is already synthesized, that is already giving the answer.
Yeah.
And at the same time, building the capacity in public administration to be able to handle scientific evidence.
Yeah. Okay, so much for the consultants. We are living in the age of the big con, as one of our colleagues called it in a recent book. Important question, and I think also the response about timing, and if we can get scientists to actually respond in a timely manner, and not saying that we need another 10 years for doing basic frontier research and then putting all our ideas through peer review processes. That is simply not up to speed with the policy making process, so things need to be done there. The gentleman in the back, and you're also welcome to reflect rather than just ask questions. So
thank you very much for the presence. My name is Gyokra Strongwe from the Zimbabwe Evidence-Informed Policy Network. I wanted to ask, maybe from Sri Lanka and Japan, around the political economy of evidence.
Sure.
Yeah, there is the issue of political economy of evidence production versus the SPIs. I don't know what has been the efficacy and the effectiveness in terms of uptake of the evidence, given the fact that these two different countries have two different political systems.
Yes.
What has been the role of the types of governance and the types of political systems in determining the effectiveness of an SPI within Sri Lanka or Japan?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's pretty straightforward.
In Sri Lanka, the governance structure is such that for science advice, it's, at presidential level there are science advisors, then at ministerial level there are science advisors. So, and the quality or the capacity of these advisors vary widely. So since there are no prescribed or like structures or any qualities that are defined to appoint these science advisors, each member would appoint like your personal physician or people like that who are ineffective. So it's mainly the problem of pseudoscience that has affected our systems really.
Yeah. So a bit a matter also of coincidence and networks and people who already know each other. That sort of, the question was about the political economy and the expectations. But I see that this is not so well institutionalized at times, and I will report from the other end of the world, from Denmark, Copenhagen, it's the same. It's also very much based on relationship and networks and people who get to sit on panels rather than having a formalized procedure. So I can very much echo that. How does it look like in Japan, was the question.
Yes, in Japan, government committees play large roles. Yeah. There are 2,000 government committees, and that's a rough number. But they, in effect, decide the policies. But traditionally, in the Japanese political economy, the power of the bureaucrats are very strong. So the decision made by the government committees were largely prepared by bureaucrats. So experts just make minor comments, and very minute revisions were made to the draft. So basically, the government committees just authorizes what bureaucrats have made. So that is not substantial scientific advice, because that's just minor revisions. Recently, the importance of evidence is increasingly recognized. And as I see, the role of government laboratories are increasing. Japanese ministries have many government public laboratories, which has very strong research capabilities. And until recently, those government laboratories just did research, just wrote papers. But now, in Japan, the evidence-based policymaking is emphasized, and the government laboratory is expected to play the role of the intermediary organization connecting the government to the academic community. Mm-hmm. So I think the landscape is changing in Japan. Thank you.
So somewhat more institutionalized and more formalized than what we heard from other colleagues. Interesting. I was taught by my professor that it's sometimes better to stop a Q&A 5 minutes before time than 5 minutes after the session was supposed to stop, and people are tired and escaping the room. But given the fact that we were starting 15 minutes late, I will take another 5 minutes of yours and then transition to lunch. And I have two gentlemen waiting to articulate your comments, and I will take them in a bundle. So please, you first, sir.
Thank you. First, I really appreciate the great presentations.
Tell us who you are, please.
My name is Dr. Wahid. I come from Afghanistan. Mine will be more of a reflection or comment. Having served as a Minister of Health in my background and my relationship with academia, my experience, at least in a complex context like Afghanistan, shows that the first point is that we have to make sure that when we talk about SPI, the advisorships, or the consultancy issues, yes, we have to make sure that we have a taste of the local context. There is a huge difference between Europe and other contexts, or Africa or Muslim countries, how people are expected and expect to get advice and share advice and consult with each other. So the cultural spice is very, very relevant and important. And one of the reasons that when it comes to consultancies, that in fragile contexts like Afghanistan, the distance and the gap between the scientists and the policymakers is widening, is the experience of last 20 years we had with the consultants and advisors coming from other parts of the world. They may have been the best in their contexts, but their relevance to what I needed was the question, and that created a very negative experience that I have a lot to share about it. The second part is, it is very easy in common, with due respect, with scientists to blame policymakers. That, okay, they don't listen to us and they do something, and then when they face a challenge, an emergency, they come back to us. So I really like the way our colleague from the European Union explained. It depends on the scientists and these thinking hubs to make sure that they realize the complexity of the context. Yeah. They have the capacity to provide an advice that helps the policymakers. The ideals should match with the reals. Yes. So when for me, a politician, when I hear things that it is good to be put in books, but it does not help my case of today, then I try not to listen. Let's make sure that we realize the appetite of the consumers. It is not only the health needs of human being which determines what we eat today at lunch. There are other factors that influence our appetite of today as well. So the scientists community have to make sure that part as well. It is a marketing approach. We have to make sure what we produce is marketable in it. If the demand is not there, at some points you say they're not listening. Supply can induce it at some points. I thank you.
Thank you, sir. Very good.
And I hope in the future we have university students here.
We do have a couple. I would be tempted to end here because that was exactly the remark we were looking for. But Jeff, I know you wrote a blog post or paper recently about ecosystems. So give us our final reflection.
My name's Jeff Mulgan. I'm from University College London. So this is a comment prompted by what you said about power and political economy, but also by the fact it's about to be lunch.
Right.
So in nature, ecosystems are things where things eat each other. They sometimes collaborate, but they also compete brutally. You, as most people do, use ecosystem as a sort of metaphor for harmony. But of course, in reality, what you're talking about are ferociously competitive systems with the consultants and all sorts of players. In a way, the question is, how much is competition part of these realities? When is it positive? Because probably it is quite positive. Australia, it's very interesting. Evidence has been used against the consultancies in the last year, rather brutally.
Yeah.
When is it constructive, but also when is it damaging? But maybe, so I'm afraid that was a question, but it's the wrong time to have a question.
It's a valid, very good question. Competition versus collaboration. And I think it might be a question we can also use to transition to lunch in 30 seconds from now. But let's just see, you know, are you willing to reflect with Jeff here? Is there something to be said about the first competition and how to either avoid it, accept it, facilitate it? Oh, you see, that's the dark side of science advice. We saw a colleague, Roger Pilge, wrote a piece about what he called shadow science advice during the pandemic, a real competition among scientists to become that advisor. And how competition definitely is part of an ecosystem that can also oyster members of that ecosystem or put them into the center. Agna, you get the...
Well, Jeff was looking at me, so now I feel kind of like that I need to reply.
He knows what's going on inside the commission, so...
Of course, there is always a competition. You never avoid the competition. And is it the competition between actually the scientists and the think tanks or big consultants? Is it the competition between the scientists, between the different domains, who gets more funding for which project and so on? Is it the competition between ministers? I'm the more effective, you know, I'm the more effective, I'm getting the better job, I did it well. This element is always there where we walk in the GRC, what we try to enhance is actually the culture of collaboration. And it is, I admit, very difficult. Because in order to work in our ideal world, how the GRC team on Science for Policy see it, that really needs a cultural shift. That really needs a cultural shift both in scientific world and in policy-making world. But saying that, we, of course, trying to work cross boundaries and cross silos and cross competitions. We are trying to prove that this is a win-win situation for everybody here, because this is precisely it. This is a win-win. If a policymaker is able to understand the science and based their decision on the science, they get legitimacy. It's the same for the scientists. Scientists finally can, you know, okay, fine. If you do the research career, probably in your research assessment, it's basically how much you publish where and how many students you have. Yes, David, is it like that?
Well, it is like that to some extent.
You are not, basically, you know, you don't get additional points by talking to us in the GRC. But nevertheless, also for the scientists, this is a win-win. They can really see the impact of their work on ordinary citizens. And then you lead me to the third point, because we very often, when we talk about the ecosystem or the interface or the architecture or whatever you want to call it, we forget about the citizens. Yeah. They are the most important element there, because you're looking for the legitimization from them. You're looking for the trust, and they need to be part of that equation too.
Complicated.
I know.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I reply to Jeff's questions actually at the end. So yes, there is a competition, Jeff, and yes, we're trying to overcome the...
Yeah. Could we at least, I mean, organizing the session today and also being part of INGSA now for a decade, there is a collaborative spirit around science advice. We know that there are egos in science advice, and there are also these ecosystems of people who actually move things on the ground and makes it work, including staff and professional staff and knowledge brokers and departmental science advisors and scientists ourselves. So I would say that the overall spirit, at least what we're trying to promote at the level of INGSA, is collaboration, but in a world of politics, obviously, and also of scarce resources, there is competition, and I think it was great to infuse that because it's part of the picture. From now on off, there is only precious between us and our lunch, precious.
No pressure, no, I'll be very quick. But I really like the last comment / question, because when we say we need to understand the silos, why are they there in the first place? We've come to understand that it's usually because of 1, competition, 2, protection, where we say we have a lot of centers of excellence, but they're not communicating to each other. Why? And then we feel, okay, they're protecting their information. So this is to say, as we map the systems, it's very important, we can't stress the point enough, to say we need to understand why these things, why these challenges are there in the very first place. Then we'll be able to kind of break through.
Great. With those words, we are concluding the session. Thank you to all our panelists.